Bo Winegard. It's a great pleasure to talk to you again. You and I talked before. The last time was via phone. This time you and I, sharing in a screen, and we can actually see each other, which is great.
Yes, that is
Thank
nice.
you so much for being with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Um, Many things I wanted to talk to you, but I think we can, pick at some point and then go ahead. You and I had a fair conversation about use of Twitter last time, but going back to your Twitter writings these days, you are getting more and more to the point about what's around and what's going on. And last time also we spoke, you were still teaching your position, and maybe we're not that much of a free to talk. So I wanted to start with what we are seeing these days. Is it fair to say you're one of the latest casualties of the cancel culture that goes on?
I mean, I actually think mine was a little bit before it got really mad and crazy, which I'm, I mean, it's odd, but I'm kind of happy about that because it it meant that I got a little more attention. I feel as though I would have just been lost in the mix of people who are getting taken out now. But yes, my contract is, I mean, I think I get paid or whatever through the summer, but my job's done. So I'm not, I don't feel as though I represent Marietta College anymore, which is liberating. So I can talk about whatever I want to on Twitter and I don't have to worry about it, which also during this period, I'd say maybe the last 3 weeks or whatever, since the sort of George Floyd protests have took off, it's been or since they took off, it's been particularly bad, at least from my perspective and from the political goals of people in my coalition. So I'm happy that I'm liberated to talk about it, candidly.
So let's dig into it. I talked to a journalism student that was fired for writing an op-ed a couple of days ago. It's bizarre. It's a journalism school, and she wrote a very in a concrete piece. But she was fired just because it was a little bit on conservative views. I don't know what's happening. Could you give us some kind of a sense from your point of view? What is happening right now? What we are seeing through these movements and this scream of cancel culture and this craziness that goes around? Because it's very scary, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree. So I'm in the same sort of boat, kind of terrified and horrified at what I've been seeing. I don't have a great analysis other than culture has been moving sort of slowly in this direction since, at least like 2012 or something. I mean, I remember having conversations with people back in 2012, 13, just like, hey, some illiberalism, it's kind of bad, whatever, but let's be cautious, let's be charitable. It's not that bad. Don't nitpick. Don't point at the crazies and say that represents the other side. And I think since then it's almost been a linear trend of badness that just exploded, I would say, in the past, what, 3 weeks or something. I mean, maybe it was getting worse because Noah Carl got fired, I got fired, Kaufness can't get a job, Colin Wright can't get a job. All of this stuff happened like in the last sort of school year, but it seems to me that this last 3 weeks has opened up an opportunity for those progressive, illiberal progressives, I would call them, to flex their muscles, and they're not wasting the opportunity to do so. So they got, I mean, an article in Personality and Individual Differences got retracted from 2012. James Bennett, the opinion editor at the New York Times, had to step down because they published this Tom Cotton op-ed. I mean, I can't even keep track of all of the people who have sort of fallen victim to this, what I've called a soft cultural revolution. I mean, we don't want to exaggerate. Nobody's, to my knowledge, getting tortured or brutalized, but there's a lot of humiliation and terror, and people are afraid to say what they think. And I know a lot of people who are, sort of suffering a lot of anxiety, etc., because of things they had written before that they're worried they might come out, the mob might come for me. So it just seems as though it's sort of an acceleration of these illiberal trends that I think mostly started from educated elites in the mainstream media and especially in academia, and have become more and more a part of ordinary culture. It's kind of just spread out from there. And I mean, I don't know where it's going to end. I really don't. It's only been going in one direction since it started, so there's no reason to think that it would go the other direction. And if this past 3 weeks is like any indication of how bad it's going to get really bad. And I mean, also, it's important to think about is these, I guess you could call them activists, they're not like squandering this opportunity. So they're putting people in positions of power who share their views, like diversity editors at the Washington Post, for example. More diversity here and there. And like, let's be honest, diversity as it's used in mainstream discourse is essentially code for more positions for people of color. And if that's a goal that you support, that's fine. We can talk about that. But let's be honest about what that means, right?
Isn't it form of also equality of outcome?
Yes, I think that it is. Yeah, I think that's one of the things this is a reason, people have often asked me throughout my career, why are you obsessed with, race differences or human variation, whatever you want to call it, whatever term is appropriate and not canceled. And this is exactly why. Because if you don't have an understanding of human variation, then you treat every inequality of outcome as evidence of discrimination or prejudice. And that's what we're seeing, like with policing, for example. You have to look at, I'm not saying there aren't any inequities in policing and injustices, but if we're going to be serious about any kind of analysis there, we have to look at the underlying differences in criminal offending, especially violent criminal offending. How likely is a certain group to kill a police officer? And then, as I always say, if your analysis, let's say your analysis says, well, black people are shot more often and it can't be explained by these variables. What does your analysis tell us about the disparity between men and women? Right? Because men are shot much more often than women by police officers, not surprisingly, because they commit a lot more violent crime. And I suspect there's
prison population.
Yes, prison population. Yeah. Overwhelmingly men. And in fact, to my knowledge, the best evidence of actual bias in the criminal justice system, there was a study that showed that, now, I don't think you can control for all relevant variables, but to the extent that you can, men get longer sentences for the same crimes, even after controlling for all of the variables they could control for. Which, again, it's not surprising because men are more violent. They're probably more likely to offend again, etc. And it makes sense. But if we're going to be serious about an analysis about disparities between groups, we have to consider the same factors, which a lot of people don't. And so you see this casual description of, oh, the police are hunting down black people or whatever. And it's just its fidelity to reality is tenuous at best, because we're talking about every death is a tragedy, obviously, but we're talking about a very small number of people who are shot and killed by the police. One wishes it were zero, but obviously that's not feasible. So let's be real about what we're dealing with. If we think that's an injustice, that's fine, and we can talk about it, and we can attempt to alleviate the problem, etc. But let's not act as though, we're reigning under a white supremacist regime that's going around and killing people of color because we're, prejudiced or whatever.
What worries me, the reason that I have suspicions about this whole movement is that, yes, of course, we are living in society that, is not matching with our evolutionary sense of, progress.
Mm-hmm.
And there are problems. There are, corruptions, issues. It's been since the beginning of the modern age, and it still exists today. But I don't see any of these movements going through fixing things genuinely. This is the equality of outcome in a different language or in a different setting, which is a totally, ideological revolutionary thing that they're trying to push in. Right. And that is why it's not sitting well with anyone. Even those who are, genuinely want to do something about it, they cannot be part of this, because this is not about any reform or any injustice. It's about, inflicting an ideology and change the society radically. That's my take.
I mean, I think there's a lot of that. And no, I think to be charitable, see, this is why, again, I think understanding group differences is so crucial to the equation here. Because to be charitable, if I'm a person who doesn't understand group differences, and I see large disparities, which there are large disparities in arrest rates, there are large disparities in income, disparities in wealth, etc. I would think, well, that's at least facial evidence of a discriminatory society. And that's not really unreasonable. That's why you have to, and that would lead to what maybe you and I would consider a radical agenda, which is trying to equalize. The reason I think we think it's radical is because we understand that the only way you would ever equalize society, in the same way that the only way you would equalize individuals, is through draconian methods, right? You have to use coercion to create equality, because otherwise what you might call quote unquote natural inequalities will play out. I mean, freedom leads to more inequality. That's sort of a rule of history, right? So that's why I agree with you and consider it radical, because it's completely unmoored from an understanding of human reality. And that means it's, one, doomed to failure, and two, will inevitably be illiberal as it attempts to get to the failed end, right? Because you have to coerce people to get, and we can already see this, right? So I mean, I'm just picking one example. There are plenty of other examples of this. I think Adidas said 30% of their future hirings will be people of color. Well, okay. I mean, if somebody wants to defend that, they can try to defend that. I find that kind of a explicit interest in demographic, characteristics abhorrent, but I'm willing to debate it. But that's coercion. That's saying, if you don't fit this demographic characteristic, you can't get this job, even if you're the most qualified person left, right? That's been happening in education for a long time. I mean, there are enormous advantages to Black people, for example. We don't like to talk about these things because they make people uncomfortable, but like the sort of SAT advantage that you get if you're Black is pretty large. And again, that's another kind of coercive policy, in the sense that it's a deviation from a meritocratic society that I think most people, if you ask most people in the abstract, they find meritocracy fair. They're like, yeah, if you are the more qualified person, you should get the job or the place in the class of 2020 or whatever it happens to be. Now, I'm not saying you can't defend those policies, but let's be honest about what's happening and have that debate. And one of the chief problems here is that the mere data themselves are suppressed. Or if you hold them up and say, well, let's have a conversation about this, people seem to find it indecent. So like pointing to disparate crime rates or differences in IQ scores or SAT or GRE, right? Merely pointing these out and saying, well, let's have this conversation is enough to get you called a vile name and and people in the mainstream media, they don't even have to deal with it. They're not even going to deal with the data. Or if they are, they'll just say like, oh, well, standardized tests are biased or whatever it happens to be, right? And so we're just not even having the appropriate conversations, in my opinion. I mean, I will say I've never been more depressed about the sort of state of truth in the world. No, I've only been on the planet for, 40 years or whatever. So take that as it is, but I've never seen such a disregard for the truth in a sense that a group of people can, comfortably suppress the truth, suppress the normal scientific method, get articles retracted that maybe they're wrong, but they're 8 years old, and like that's how science works, like if we start retracting everything that offends our sensibilities, or maybe we've learned more about it or whatever, we're going to retract the entire history of science. So all of these things are profoundly disconcerting to me. Although I have to say, like, I think the poll numbers suggest that you and I are actually perhaps in the minority. Like, I mean, I've seen poll numbers that look quite favorable to Black Lives Matter, for example. And for a lot of these things, Biden is on pace to absolutely annihilate Trump right now. I mean, I'm not saying that will happen, but he, in national polls, according to 538, he's got a 9-point lead. Now, I understand Trump's sort of like particularly repulsive to a lot of people, but I mean, that suggests I'm a little worried that this is more popular than we would like it to be.
Couple of things came up. Let's go through it. But about the polls, I don't take them seriously because because the media or the elite part of mainstream media made Trump so evil. Lots of people are hesitant to announce that they are, voting for him. I didn't vote for him, but I don't like the demonizing of him that I see all over. I think our thing is you can criticize him, and there are things that you have credit him because he did a good job. I'm not demonizing, but everyone I talk to, I don't think anyone publicly say they vote for Trump. Yeah. But that is why I think he will win again this time, even this time with the popular vote. Because again, those who are seeing things around you who they are not comfortable with it. So this is about the poll. The other thing when you said about retracting from history, I mean, I've seen it happening. I mean, Soviet Union, one of those, lots of theocracy countries in the world, they're just changing, I mean, in country of Iran, I'm originally from Iran. In Iran, every year the history books are changing because someone says something that they weren't supposed to say, and they retracted from all over the records in the last 30 or 40 years or so. So this is something I've seen. China is doing that. Many countries are doing that. But in the United States, we never see that because one of the things that I, really treasure and value is that you have the right to make mistake in life, because if you don't make mistake, you don't learn anything. I mean, I think that's the essential thing that we learn in school. That is why we are a grading system. So you pass a test, you do X amount right, X amount failed, and you see what you have to work on. So we cannot ever be, infallible or perfect creatures. We make mistakes. And we cannot just whitewash history or jump through it. I think this is the total annihilation of the whole system of learning and educating. And if you take that out of the equation, how do you want to learn? It's impossible. It's living in a system like 1984 ideology system when you are touching parts of history like that.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a good point about like civilizations learn the same way individuals learn, which is they make mistakes, and sometimes they make incredibly bad, catastrophic mistakes. And it's really a religious phenomenon, a sacred phenomenon to try to expunge those mistakes from history as if they're so offensive to like the modern era that we can't even deal with them. That is that and it does happen in various regimes, of course, and those regimes are usually regimes that are somewhat authoritarian or totalitarian, or they have like a very strong sacred ideology, and the past is all evil and whatever. Personally, I'm actually getting to the point where I almost want to defend Confederate statues, even though I'm not particularly wedded to them, just because, look, like, it's a part of our history.
It's a part of history. You
We
can't get
don't,
rid of. That's the thing. That's what I'm telling you. I
right.
mean,
It's just, we don't have to celebrate necessarily Robert Lee or whatever. If you find him loathsome, fine. But like, yeah, I mean, I'm okay with negotiating on a few of these kinds of statues. I think, to be fair, I would be open to that. I do not like the way that it's proceeding so rapidly and with such evident contempt for people who were once revered as heroes of Western civilization because they contributed something to it, even if they were flawed, like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, etc. I mean, it's just, look, they lived at a particular time in history. It's not as if slavery was some kind of unique evil that Europeans invented. And in fact, the thing that was unique about Europeans, including both George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, is that they found slavery repugnant even as they were practicing it. And yes, they were hypocrites, but they were both aware that it was a barbaric institution, which is a lot more than you can say about many cultures that practiced it. So, I mean, I think they're almost to be commended for that. Again, I mean, it's the 1750s through 90s. It's not 2000, So, yeah, I mean, I don't like that at all. I think there is like a kind of religious puritanical fervor to it, and it's a way to sort of expunge mistakes from the record. And science is the same thing. I mean, if we went through and looked at every article published in 1950, how many of them hold up? Not very many. And that's a good thing, because if they did, that means we would have solved all of the problems in 1950,
yeah, the other thing that got me and left me very very awe-stricken, how the politicians are waving are riding these waves. I saw on the some ceremony for the Juneteenth, Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, ordered the portraits of those speakers of the House in the time of slavery to be taken down. I mean, why? The reason that we know slavery is bad because they've practiced it, and we came to the conclusion that it's bad, and they went through heavy, fights just to get rid of it and now abolish it, and it happened, and it's a great outcome. We should be really really happy that from that we came to here. But if you are the majority in the House of Representatives and you're given to this public sentiments like that, and you're not thinking like an adult, then it's becoming very very scary how much this wave could influence people. And I think especially in this year of election, I think some people are making, I don't have any evidence for it, but I think some people are making calculation that the more messy the political sphere is, the better chance they have to beat the incumbent in the election. And I think that's a very scary and irresponsible approach to that. They shouldn't go for this at any price. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't want to exaggerate, but I think there's a lot of truth to what I'm going to say here, which is it really is the case that in modern, at least in the United States, I can't speak for Europe, but in the modern United States, you're almost taught to hate your country. And that sounds extreme, but I'll talk through it. So the education that you're given is no longer, America's this singular experiment. It's this great place. We should be proud of the Europeans who came here and who created these institutions. And yeah, they had some flaws, but they debated them and they corrected them and all of these kinds of things. And what you're taught instead is that Europeans were like uniquely iniquitous, that they came over here and savaged the Native Americans, which they did. I mean, there was nothing pleasant about that, but it's not as if other groups wouldn't have done this. I mean, it just happened to be the case that the Europeans were the most advanced. I mean, China might have been at that point. Well, no, not at that point. So in the 1700s, let's say 16, 1700s, the Europeans are the most advanced. And so they're exploring and colonizing the globe. And that was kind of heinous at times, but they also created brilliant civilizations, such as the one in the United States. And there are lots of things we should be proud of. But from that moment, then we get it was just built on racism. We get slavery. We get it was pretty disgusting. Even the Civil War. Well, actually, Abraham Lincoln was kind of racist if you look at what he said. And the 1619 Project now is making these arguments about how sort of the fundamentals of the American society was built on slavery, and the American Revolution was actually fought for slavery and not the ideals that, we used to celebrate. And Howard Zinn's A People's History is sort of a good example of this. And I know this book well because I read it at least twice when I was younger and when I was like kind of progressive. And it's just one litany of the sins of the United States. I mean, basically, the thesis of the book is powerful white men have screwed up everything in every way you can possibly imagine. And the only noble people in history are the downtrodden victims. I mean, it really is.
No, I read that book. I think for a time it was the must-read about the history of the West. That's Howard Zinn's book. That's how I read it. Someone said, "Do you want to know about West? You have to start with this one." Right. And I later heard from someone that the problem with the kids these days that they are listening to Howard Zinn, which was not a well-qualified historian, and they don't actually read the historian who did the work. So that's the
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because one of my intellectual heroes is Gordon Wood, who's a historian of the founding generation of the United States. Mostly, he's written a couple books, really brilliant books about that time period. And like every book of his lately, like the preface is always like, it seems as though it's getting like angrier and angrier about how politics are intruding in the way we talk about the past, and how he wouldn't call it this, but I'll call it this, how it's just getting so much more woke that you can't even talk, like regularly about American politics in the past anymore. Howard Zinn is a good example of somebody who just went full out on this. Now, like, look, if Howard Zinn said, and maybe he would say this, but if somebody said, look, like, if you read 4 books and then you read Howard Zinn just for some sort of like dissenting opinion, that would be a good thing, I would say fine, yeah. But that's actually a textbook, as far as I understand, for a lot of high schools. And I'm sure for a lot of colleges as well. And for a lot of those kids, that's the only book they're reading. Or if they're probably not even reading it, the teacher's teaching from it, and they're just getting the lessons that, the United States was uniquely heinous, and look at all of these massive sins, imperialism, the Philippines, all of these terrible things that the United States did. So I really do, I think that these kinds of lessons add up. And now you have 19 to 20-year-olds to, whatever, younger people today, let's just say, who really do dislike everything about our society and really do think that it was this just oppressive imperialist project that's almost unredeemable, and that the only way to become a morally decent place is to tear down everything in the past and to try to start this progressive, like, racial justice future, which I can say from what I've seen of it is very illiberal and very unpleasant. But so yeah, I mean, I do think that matters. I again, I don't want to exaggerate. I don't know. I can only talk about what I see and people that I've talked to and what I've read. But I think there's probably a great degree of self-loathing in the United States and in the West more broadly, that maybe people who weren't raised here and they come here, they don't understand it because they're like, this is pretty awesome. Like, you guys are doing a lot of things the right way. And I think the sort of white guilt that we have clouds our vision of all of the great things that we have accomplished.
Well, absolutely. If United States is such a bad place, what is the number one desired country in the world?
Right.
Everyone wants to come here. Almost
Yes.
anyone. I mean, there's no country in the world that someone says, I'm thinking about United States and this. Impossible.
Right.
Everyone wants to come here and live here. So there should be something, but I think this constant teaching that America is bad, we are horrible, we did horrible things or so, which I think that's part of history. I don't think you can find any Puritan history anywhere. All of them did horrible things. It's impossible. That's history. You cannot find in one specific law say these were great, they didn't do anything wrong. No, all of them are almost human. This is the common thing among us. We are capable of doing horrible things, and we do horrible things.
Right.
That's the thing we do.
Yes, I totally agree. And I mean, I don't have a problem with pointing out some horrible things, right? That's fine. I mean, but if we're going to do that, we should also tally all of the great things that we've accomplished and have some pride in our civilization. It's so weird that if you express pride for Western civilization, it's almost viewed as like a microaggression. I mean, people actually get actively upset about that, as if you're like somehow a bad human because you want to celebrate the greatest civilization the world has known. And it's just really bizarre to me. And also it's like viewed as if that is ipso facto racist, which is only the case if you think that Western civilization is exclusively European and that nobody else participated in it, which of course I don't think. I think any group that wants to share in the sort of, who believes in those ideals of individualism, rule of law, markets, limited government, I'm cool with that. And so like I don't see this racial component to the way that maybe people who would claim that it's ipso facto racist to praise it would. It's just weird. I mean, to me it's kind of sad, really. It's sad because it's, you're gonna lose it if enough people turn against it and feel as though there's really nothing worth saving here, and Thomas Jefferson, such a despicable human being, like what point is there in celebrating it? You lose it because societies are fragile. The norms that we've created and the institutions we've created and the principles that we've promulgated and successfully maintained for 200 and some years, those things aren't like a gift of the gods. They were hard-won prizes wrested from sort of the savagery of human nature by our forebears, and now we're kind of like spitting on that and rejecting that. And I see it in science, where like something where I care about a lot, where you just sort of the principle of free inquiry and free speech and trying to address issues through debate and the truth instead of through name calling and retraction, that just does not bode well, because science it's a very difficult thing to establish. And the fact that we sort of had it for 200 and some years where truth was the primary goal. Of course, there were other interests always, but that was the primary goal. And we had these norms of debate, and I don't want to say civility, that might be a strong word, but not trying to cancel people who came to the wrong scientific conclusions, and I just see that we are drifting so far from that. I mean, I don't know how many academics I know, but I don't know any who are feeling good about academia. I mean, it's such an illiberal place at this point. It's overrun by progressives and diversity bureaucrats. It's just truly, it's almost hard to parody at this point. And people will say, "Oh, Winegard, you're exaggerating. That's a bunch of hyperbole." It's really not. I mean, it's not. It's that bad. I mean, I was on a diversity committee last year, which I'm glad that I was, because it opened my eyes to just how how like fanatical the ideology is and how crazy it is and how, I mean, people, this is maybe a little bit more controversial, but people want, you have to celebrate every culture except for your own. You know, oh well, we should celebrate all of these diverse cultures. And frankly, I don't want to. I like Western culture. I think we did.
Yours isn't taboo. You shouldn't.
Right, exactly. Like ours is the one taboo where you're not supposed to celebrate it. So you're supposed to celebrate all these illiberal cultures that I don't frankly want anything to do with. I mean, people don't want to live in those countries, and they don't for a reason, because they don't have the kinds of norms that we value here, or at least that I value. And anyway, I mean, you know, just point being, I'm not trying to exaggerate. I really think it is that bad. And I'm somebody who tried to keep myself in check for most of the progress here from like 2012 and saying, okay, don't exaggerate, don't get histrionic, don't pick from the crazies, but I'm done with that. I mean, it's that bad.
No, I have friends, academics, who were always centrist for many years now, but even the most centrist one looks right now because everything is so far driven that way. And you know, I talk to my friends and say we never wanted to be, you know, affiliated with, and you know, identified as right. But so be it. I cannot even be close to these people. I still consider myself center, but if that center looks right, fine. I'm pretty much fine with where I am. If you want to label me right, go ahead, do it.
I'll take you one further. I would even say that there are people who are pretty left who are like, I look like right compared to this, right? So like, in fact, I almost see what's happening is like the fundamental dividing lines that we used to have kind of disappeared for other ones. So I'll give you an example. So like, I'm for single payer health insurance, and I'm actually pretty quote unquote liberal economically. The thing that ends up making me seem really conservative, and I share conservative principles of slow incremental change, but the thing where I get really conservative is I have the views of like Harry Truman on America, right? And so that makes me an extreme right winger now to have the views of the president 70 some, you know, 80, whatever years ago, right? 70 years ago. That's how crazy the sort of thing has changed, and the debate lines are more about, it seems to me, race, immigration, you know, religion or diversity, multiculturalism, those kinds of things, where I'm now extremely conservative for views that would have been taken for granted by our forebears 2-3 generations ago, right? And that's what's really changed. And I mean, I honestly know people who are very liberal, who seem right-wing in the academy, and they're actually afraid to talk about their beliefs, even though they voted Democrat every single election. They're going to vote Democrat in 2020, and they're very liberal. That's how bad it is.
One thing we touched upon, you mentioned Adidas. I think some of these companies, I think they're sort of, you know, communication and you know, campaign for better financing for them. Because here's the thing, you know, if you now, for example, open you know, entertainment services like Netflix or HBO or Amazon Prime or Prime Video, almost everyone has a section for Black History Month or Black Lives Matter, or which is fine. That's my choice if I want to watch or not. That's right. I'm not criticizing that, but every company in the world, the successful company in the world, it works best on merit based. No company can say, okay, we have like 50%, whoever the people they want to be, 50% are going to work. No, that system collapses in a second.
Right.
That's history of economy, and it's very, very, you know, it's been tested over and over, I think more than anything, in practice of societies all around the world. So I don't think I think maybe they just create a department just to show others, or the
Right.
again the wave that's going, that we
Right.
have this, we do this. But I think if you actually want to practice that, your business goes down. I mean, no doubt, just goes down, or is
Oh,
at least is incapable of competing.
I agree with that. And I mean, I think inevitably what will end up happening is that if the companies do practice that, they'll have to create jobs that are sort of like, essentially show jobs just for people to
It's like
do.
a showroom, the
Yeah,
same
yeah,
room that they
exactly.
have show the products they have.
Yeah.
These are our colleagues are working here.
Well, there
You
are,
show like 60 people, fully
right.
diverse, forced diverse. I call it forced diverse because
Yes,
it's
forced
merit based.
is,
How can
yeah,
you say it's forced
yeah.
diverse? So it's forced diverse, and you say, look, so we want to, make them all happy. That's what I think. I don't think it's practical for any company, even the leftist of the the equality of outcome. If you put them to run a company, I
Mhm.
think that's the first hard lesson they get. Yeah, and they have to actually implement it. They understand it, but
I
they're
think,
outside their screen. How do they know?
yeah, I think you're right on that. I think that's true, and I actually think you can see this in universities where they quickly learned that if they're going to diversify, what they have to do is create sort of departments that aren't as rigorous, and sort of it's the unspoken unspoken thing that everybody knows, which is a lot of these critical departments, critical studies, race studies, whatever, they're basically ways to diversify your faculty in a way that's much less rigorous than other departments, so that you can get, people of color in them, and that, for a variety of reasons. I'm not saying there are definitely obviously qualified people of color in physics, et cetera, but not to the degree that these universities want it, right? They want more diversity. So there's a higher demand than there is a supply. And that's kind of what they figured out as well. We can create these kinds of departments. And if you look at the standards there, they're lower, they're much more subjective, for example. So, in physics is awfully rigorous, right? Like, you can't do physics, it's going to be obvious. It's harder to judge somebody's book on critical race theory, right? It's like if you have kind of the right rhetoric and you use the correct terminology, it's hard to say. It is the case that the standards are different there, let's say, and I don't even see an attempt to grapple with objective reality. And that's, I mean, I suppose that's another thing that's really irritating to me about this whole trying to get things retracted in science is we have people who are trying to do real empirical work, and it's hard. And sometimes you make mistakes, sometimes the data aren't that good, whatever. You try your best, you go through a review process, and all you can do is say, okay, this is what we did, try to come at it, argue against it, get better data, whatever. And these fanatics are calling for retractions for those things. Meanwhile, you have people in these critical studies departments writing absolute twaddle, like just ridiculous nonsense, calling America a white supremacist country, everything's supremacist, everybody's bigoted, and nobody cares. I mean, that's fine. You can go ahead and do that. It doesn't matter if you forward any evidence or really look at the data. Who cares? And it's like, okay, well, what's more dangerous? Writing a book in which you argue that our society is hopelessly, invidiously prejudiced, or arguing that there are some group differences and we should really look at this and have an honest conversation about it. I mean, for my money, I think arguing that the structures of our society are like sort of buoyed by white supremacy is much more harmful. But it just tells you that, like, when that ideology is so completely captured the university and the mainstream intelligentsia, these, what I would consider rather trivial points, are so crazy sounding that you couldn't even really say them without getting laughed at outside of like groups of people who kind of already agree with you or are willing to hear that.
Yeah, the other thing is that I heard, I did a quick search with my friends in universities. I think most of these departments are subsidized, so they just get funds, unlimited funds to do anything publishing they want. They don't have to compete. They don't have to chase the grants. They don't have to, prove anything to make sure that it's whatever they come up, it's applicable. So they are living in a very different world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that actually is an important principle in general for a lot of the social sciences, and of course it applies to the humanities a fortiori, which is you're not disciplined by the empirical world, right? In the sense that if your ideas are stupid, it doesn't matter because if you run a business and as you were saying about this diversity thing in business, you quickly figure out it doesn't work, right? And either you go out of business or you change your ways. If you're in a social science department and you're promulgating absolute twaddle about white supremacy or something, what does it matter? In fact, if anything, that's going to help you because the right kinds of people, you'll still be able to get funding. People will celebrate you. Like IAT, for example. I mean, whatever one thinks about, there are sophisticated there's a sophisticated technical literature about it. I think it's fair to say that if there's an effect on real behavior here, it's very tiny. And if any of these sort of IAT-based, IAT, implicit association tests for people who don't know, if there's anything that these training programs do, it's also incredibly tiny. And you just look at how much capital is wasted, how much people, they spend money on this and whatever. And the reason they do it is because it doesn't really matter because you're not going to go out of business for it, right? It's just you allocate money that you're getting from somebody else. And there's no weeding out of the stupidity the way there is in business where it gets weeded out really quickly. It's an interesting thing that in general, and this is an attitude that I sort of regrettably, I think I used to have. Academics are, especially in the social sciences, tend to be pretty hostile to market capitalism and to businesses in general. And I've talked to them and they're like, oh, it's easy to make a business. I'm like, no, it's not. Making a successful business is really hard because you make mistakes and you go out of business. You don't just like move on or get praised because you made the right moral mistake. You know what I mean? Like,
and there's no safety net.
Yeah, exactly.
No safety net. You're gone.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think that is important, and that's so much more true even in the humanities, which, by the way, is where I started. I actually originally wanted to go into literature. This is in my early 20s when I was, taking literature classes quite seriously, and at that time I was on the radical left. I was like a Chomskyan, and even at that time, I was horrified by how crazy it was because it was all identity nonsense, Marxism, feminism, eco-criticism, everything's Orientalism or whatever. Like nothing, it's as if they didn't, every stupid idea in human history that had already been refuted found its way into the literary studies field where nobody seemed Freudianism. Like there were actual Freudian critics. And I'm like, you guys know that nobody takes Freud seriously and they haven't for like 80 years, right? It's where all these bad ideas just congregate because it's not about the truth. It's a sort of rhetorical manipulation, and whoever is like more clever at coming up with these terms that align with ideological preferences wins the game.
I think the amount of socialism they created for themselves, so because they don't have to compete, they just get the funds and they feel they are doing the great job. Everything is horrible, but they don't know where this money coming from. Actually, someone in capitalism and in a merit system has to work hard. Others have to pay the tax so they can get this money and enjoy. This is what frustrates me most when I read this new wave of, literature and criticism and race studies or so, because I think I don't say it lightly, but I think it's tough to go through the problems that we have in society and find out what it is, because it's complicated, multifaceted, hard to follow, and it's very, very, uniquely different from one case to another, and there's no way that you can generalize it. But it's a very, very deceitful way just to sit somewhere in your corner and just criticize without even knowing what is really happening. I haven't seen any of this social justice people who at least spend some time in any kind of community and see realistically what they are going through. I've never seen any of those.
I think so, this is, I'm sorry, I'm interrupting. Just your thought.
No, go ahead.
It's a great thought, and like I think this is one important thing. And I remember coming to this conclusion. Even again, I was still like pretty like radical leftist, but I must have been like 20 or 21. And I remember I first started reading Edmund Burke, the very famous conservative. And I remember having the thought, if it were so easy to solve these problems, somebody would have done it by now. Like who am I, this 21-year-old who has no experience in the world, to think that I can solve the problem of the inner city or of these disparities or those disparities or whatever? It's just hubristic to think that, because there are lots of people who have put a lot of effort into and are on the ground, as you say, unlike these people who've actually gone on the ground, and they're like, you know what, it's really hard to solve these problems. And to a different point, so I agree, like what we need to do and what this distracts from is really understanding the world so that we can best approach these problems. That takes careful, honest, diligent study of the world, not armchair Michel Foucault inspired speculations about power or something. One thing I think is a problem is that a lot of progressives and maybe like leftists in general, they don't understand, I think, and I've talked to a lot of them, and I don't see understanding in this sense, and I'm sure I made these own errors myself, but like, you're taking tax money, you're taking money from other people who are working hard and making things that are like, increasing productivity in our society. That money is getting funneled out, taken from people, and put into these departments that are producing nonsense. Now, I'm happy to fund and to pay some taxes to fund learning literature, Homer, Virgil, because I think those are important things that are enhancing people's lives. But I don't want to see a bunch of money taken out of the economy and funneled into these departments so they can produce noxious nonsense that actually turns people against the very civilization that's allowing them to flourish, and it's weird because it really is in some sense coercive. You're taking money from people. Now, I'm okay with that to some degree in some cases because I think it's worth the trade-off, but let's be honest about it, right? That's what's happening. People who are doing something productive are paying a price. They're paying for you, and then you're taking it and you're teaching, people to hate the very system that allows you to have your luxurious life. And that I think is, it's almost inevitable. I think Joseph Schumpeter, among other people, talked about this process and that it was kind of like an inevitable thing with an affluent society, but it's also really unfortunate.
No, it's so complicated and bad that I sometimes don't know if it's just affluence that got out of hand, or is it some kind of a conspiracy theory behind it that some countries are actually promoting this in the at least in the academic schools, so to cause this outcome.
You mean like hostile countries? Well, certainly, I mean, I don't think we need to go too, I don't know, I don't think they were doing it from the beginning for nefarious reasons, but it's clearly the case now that countries Russia, China, for example, take advantage of this because they know where the cleavage lines are in the US, and they're these race-based, identity-based issues that they know they can take advantage of. So they have BLM bots, but then also anti-BLM bots to stir up and foment hatred. And I imagine can you imagine if you were a Chinese person high up in the government, and you're just reading like this post-colonial garbage, and you just have to be laughing hysterically at this culture that's immolating itself while you're like preparing to take its place, right? Like you're replacing them, and they're just waddling in decadence, writing this nonsense about how their society is the worst, most exploitive society in history. Yeah, I mean, it really is. I would call it a conspiracy of interest. That is to say, it's not like some malicious figures got together and they were like, oh, we're going to do this. It's just a bunch of things happen all at once that sort of conspire to make this possible. I've called it even decadent wokeism after there's the New York Times writer Ross Douthat, who wrote the book on the decadent society, it's called, when he talks about American decadence. And I think if you add like
I read that book.
Pardon?
I read that book. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, okay, great. And so like I think if you add like woke to that, to think about like the sort of like addition to that decadent idea of like a society that's just spinning its wheels. It really has nowhere to go. You've conquered the frontier. You can't go to space. You have no like unified vision of what's our purpose anymore. Then you just turn inward with all of this like identity fighting and like bitterness and rancor and language games, etc. I don't know. I mean, maybe this is my hope. A year from now, we can watch this and be like, man, we were really exaggerating the problem. We were going like crazy, and what were we doing? I'm afraid that probably won't be true, but I hope so.
As for the hope goes, yeah, I think all of us are really hoping that, but it's something of it scary. I mean, seeing the left that was the biggest supporter of freedom of speech, and almost anyone had this good understanding about freedom of speech, that yes, you can say anything you want, but you cannot invoke violence or right. These were the common sense that we all had in mind, from left and right. Freedom of speech, yes, these are no. But now we're going through the fascism type of freedom of speech. You have to be quiet because your speech is not tolerated.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought a lot about that point that you're making, about the way that the left has went from being perhaps even the bigger champion of free speech to now the most regressive group. And I think it's interesting because you think like old figures of the left, Noam Chomsky, so he's in his 90s now, fervid advocate of free speech, defending Holocaust deniers. And that's what the left used to be. And I think what happened, I tried to think about this. I'm like, okay, when Chomsky grew up and went through the academy, it was liberal, but it was liberal in the Daniel Bell centrist sort of like Schlesinger way, not the radical way Chomsky was left, right? And he actually took a lot of flack early on, and he talks about like, giving these lectures with 2 people who attended and 4 people who were like throwing stuff, and they were defending free speech because they were not the majority in academia at that time. And usually it's the weaker group that defends free speech, right? Because they have these ideas that are getting suppressed. And so the old left learned to defend free speech for both sides because of that, because it helped them too. As the left became the hegemonic power in academia, though, it saw no use for free speech anymore. Like, what do we need it for? My speech isn't getting suppressed. In fact, suppressing speech is a useful tool to hold down our ideological enemies. And I think that's kind of what's happened, which makes sense of why sort of like the generations get worse about it. And so like now at this point with young kids are the worst by far of any of these groups because they've grown up in a completely dominant position culturally, right? The sort of progressive position just owns the academy. And like, yeah, free speech is going to be costly to their immediate interest because they can use it to suppress arguments they don't want to deal with. And so it's not actually too surprising that it's happened. I mean, it's really unfortunate, but in sort of like a straightforward power analysis, it's not terribly surprising. And, I again, I mean, unfortunately, I don't see that changing until you mix up the political composition of academia. And I don't see that happening anytime soon because more and more conservatives or even centrists, as you noted, are fleeing academia or getting fired, one of the two.
Either you're suppressed or censored. So there's either of two. There's no other option for them to stay in and do something about it. That is why.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it is true. I mean, the fact of the matter is you have people like Calvin Wright who can't even get a job in academia. So you're like weeded out before you even get to the job market now. And I'm sure that if I were on the job market today in the atmosphere that prevails today, I would not. I mean, I had a hard enough time getting a job, but I'm sure I would not have gotten a job. And obviously I got fired from mine. And so, yeah, I mean, if you're going to, the only way you can survive in the social sciences as a conservative is to keep your views to yourself and like work on something that's not too offensive to liberals. So like maybe you could do something on like adoption or like having a father, like what is having a fatherless household. I think you can still get away with some of that stuff and like you could be okay. But if you talk openly about trans issues or race or immigration or sex issues, you're pretty much done. I mean, you just can't do it. And everybody kind of knows it. I mean, everybody I talk to is fully aware of it. And I can't tell you how many people's views I know privately that they will never say publicly because they're afraid to. And like, I don't blame them. If you have a family you have to take care of, I would keep my views to myself too.
No, this is it. This is one of the times that I have my best conversation off the record. People, I have wonderful conversation with people off the record, but on the record, no one wants to say any of that.
Yes. I totally agree, which is why, I mean, I tried to do this as a professor and I got fired. So it tells you it's maybe not a very viable strategy, but my goal as an academic was always to be on the record the same I was off the record. I thought that's the intellectually honest thing to do. I would, of course, say I don't know all of the answers, but these are my opinions or whatever. But you just can't do that anymore. And you're right. All of the conversations I have are much better off the record, too. And that's just so sad, especially, I mean, we can debate about that in the public sphere, right? Because, I don't think politicians have to be great truth tellers. I mean, I'd rather they not lie. But I understand, like, Obama doesn't need to talk about the bell curve or something. But academia is specifically supposed to be cordoned off specifically to have free exchanges of ideas. And now
that's what it's designed to do.
Exactly.
I think the original idea was to do this. Get them somewhere and let's go at each other and find out what works and what doesn't work.
Exactly. And the fact that now it's actually less tolerant than the average family's dinner conversation is truly should be an embarrassment to anybody who's in academia. I mean, they should just feel ashamed about that. I mean, I seriously can have better conversations at the dinner table of my family members or my fiance's family or, probably just a random family in West Virginia. We could have a better conversation that's more open than I can in academia. And that's just sad. It's a sad testament to a declining institution.
So just to close down, for someone like you and I, if we want to do something right now, what do you think the best thing we should do, or we could do?
You know what? I'm going to say this and maybe you'll disagree with me, and that's okay. I'm going to say just being out there and being open is one important thing. And I'm doing that on Twitter. Maybe it's a waste of my time, maybe not. But you know what? There are lots of people, I think, who see that. And I talk to people privately who they met me, they found me on Twitter and they said, that's really interesting, or, like I have these same thoughts. And now I talk to people privately about things. I think that's really important because people in these moments, they feel alone. And I don't want to say this is like the Chinese Cultural Revolution. Obviously, that's an exaggeration. But there's this sort of, as I said, soft cultural revolution aspect to it. And one thing there's a woman wrote a book on the Cultural Revolution, and she noted like one of the worst things about the Cultural Revolution was how it would destroy communities because you could never talk to anybody because you didn't know who would turn you in and who wouldn't. And maybe they would criticize the regime only so you would, and then they would tell on you. And there's sort of that feel in the world today, in our world, right? Just this fear that if I say the wrong thing, they're going to go after me. Am I alone? And so just by being out there and being public and saying, no, you're not alone, people see that and they think, okay, there are some people out there who think this is crazy, who are honest about it. And that gives me hope. And I'm going to talk to those people. And then you can form these networks. And that's important. So I think like, I used to be very sort of politically independent, which I think is understandable. It's probably the intellectually sort of honest position to hold most of the time. But I think at this point, I'm more about forming a coalition, and it's the coalition of free speech, Western civilization, and like, I don't have the luxury anymore not to do that and not to say, okay, I'm in that coalition, whatever else they think, I don't really care. I care about those issues right now. Those are the most pressing issues we have. Find friends, find people in public, find people who are talking about it, and try to form alliances and understand that honestly, you're not alone. There's a lot of craziness, but there are also a lot of people privately who know this is crazy and are afraid to say it. And you got to find those people and make sure that they're there and reinforce each other and help each other and have each other's back, etc. I mean, that's the best thing I can do. I don't have political power or influence or anything. So all I can do is that. And I think I don't know if I think, but I hope that's some sort of contribution.
Well, first of all, you cannot disagree with me because you'll be censored. You know that, right?
Yes, you'll eliminate me.
I'm kidding. Yeah. No, but you raised a good point, and I think that's initially why you and I are speaking, because I think I should talk to you. You should talk to other people. We should have this debate running while we can. I don't know. Maybe the other day, one of the social, justice, big companies, merges our company, and we're not allowed to speak of this anymore. That would be different because if I talked about that, I'll be fired. So that's a different story. But two quick follow-ups on that. In recent years, there's been, Jonathan Haidt and Heterodox Academy, just to make things a little bit better, and also the Weinstein brothers and with the intellectual dark web. Do you think that kind of a movement forum that you're talking about so far have been successful, or what do you think we should do differently, that if we want to have that, effective movement that you're talking about?
Well, I should disclose for the interest of possible biases that I have, that my fiance works for Heterodox, so I can't comment dispassionately about them. I can say that anything that's devoted to that mission is better than nothing. So I strongly support the sort of mission, protecting free inquiry. FIRE, for example, is a wonderful organization as well. And I want those yes. And I mean, IDW is like this weird informal thing when I've never really understood exactly what it's supposed to be. And, people often say I'm somehow associated with IDW. I don't feel as though I am. I don't really care about IDW, frankly, but I care about people who care about free speech, free inquiry, etc. The Weinstein brothers seem to, a lot of the people who are supposedly IDW seem to share that value. And actually, it's interesting because there's sort of a heterogeneous group there who are united around those principles more than the other issues that they used to debate. So you could imagine in like a different world, these coalitions would be completely different, right? I mean, Weinstein, one of them was a Sanders supporter. I don't know about the other one, whereas you might have somebody who's a Trump supporter and somebody who's a huge Reagan fan or whatever. And now they're in this coalition because free speech, free inquiry, Western Civ. Yeah, I think that's good because that's an understanding of the more important political battle right now. And that's the more important one, I think. Like, these other issues, they're important. I don't want to downplay them, but if we lose these things, those issues won't matter.
Correct. So at least we have to reach out and keep each other, in more of a network and be active and outspoken.
Yes,
I think
totally agree.
This is something you and I can, I think all of us could share that and do our part in it.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree. And I do as best as I can. And now that I'm totally liberated from concerns about about academic institutions, I'm going to do what I'm going to do and say what I'm going to say. And I just don't care. I mean, these 3 weeks have horrified me to the point I just don't care anymore. Like, whatever. People are going to hate me. That's fine. A lot of people are going to like me, and cool. Like, I'm going to be in that coalition of people who aren't down with the mobocrats, and we're going to do what we do.
We are working more than an hour now, hour and 15 minutes now. And I think we can easily go for another couple of hours, but I really enjoyed our talk, and
Yes.
and it was very good that we had some, we could go through some things that go in currently in our society and have some reflection on it, and hopefully hopefully we could do more of us would speak up more like you would speak up and talk, and we get some some sensible discourse to achieve something. Actually, I don't think anyone is against eradicating injustice, but we're just saying this is not the way to do it. You're just doing it wrong. It's simple and easy.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and I appreciate the conversation. You're right. We probably could go for 2 more hours, but I'm afraid I have other responsibilities, and I'm sure you do as well. So, but yeah, I mean, I'm happy to do it anytime.
So maybe later, as the situation progresses on the ground, we'll come back and give it another go.
Yeah, I'm hopeful it's a happier moment, but we'll see.
Yes. Yeah. I'm praying to that, actually. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Sure.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Bo.
Absolutely. Thank you.